I didn't see anything.
All right, 12:23 p.m. calling into session the Monday, June 5th meeting of the Manchester-Essex Regional School Committee for a workshop. Our agenda does not have public comment or subcommittee reports at this time. We are in workshop session to begin now, and I would start with a motion that we set aside Robert's rules for the purpose of conversation in this workshop format. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Unanimous. Okay. Where are we, folks?
How can we help?
And how can we help?
I will start with a comment that on the compromised budget, based on what I understood on Thursday, the savings that we're able to achieve through eliminating the reading specialist sounds to me like we may end up incurring future expenses as a result of that reduction. And if I'm understanding that correctly, Pam, I'd be in favor if we're going to consider this compromised budget as one of the budgets that we vote on tonight.
Tomorrow. For anyone listening, not voting tonight.
I'd like to consider removing that line item.
I agree. I think that if we are, if we went in this direction, and I'm personally still undecided, that if we are dipping into reserves to fund the gap, I would actually remove any line that has a programming impact. I think we had, I can't find the page. So again, all the detailed stuff. Hold on. So I think that we had said that the music was a cut against progress, but not a direct programming impact this year.
Yep, I'll just clarify that prior to, in building this year's high school schedule, adjustments were made to course offerings based on under subscription. So there were some changes made, not reduction, but yeah. So like a piano lab is not part of the schedule, but was not related to budget.
Right, got it.
Yep. Just because that could be misinterpreted as being related to the budget, but
right. I guess my hesitation with any of these is that if we end up needing to reinstate these positions out of necessity, that we are then adding back to the program and the budget gap is that much larger, plus 3.5% or 2.5% or whatever.
I guess something to keep in mind, you know, Avi and I were chatting this morning, kind of just working through some of the management work that goes along with the different scenarios. In reading and responding to lots of the inputs, I think something that's getting lost in some of the conversation that may be worth restating as we start is, while we are certainly always open to looking at new and creative ways of doing things. I think if you've been following for a while, you know that we have done a lot of reorganizations to try to improve programming and find efficiencies. We're open to that. We're open to looking at models going forward that maybe weren't originally part of our consideration. I think when you hear frustration in our voice, the frustration comes from the fact that the exercise we're going through right now it really isn't within the district's ability to solve the problem. And we are essentially cutting $3 for every $1 to solve an apportionment problem. So 2/3 of the cuts are just to achieve a number that works with the formula. They aren't necessary. That being said, we are where we're at, and what we put up has been very well thought out. I know there's just a lot of emotion whenever this happens, and if we brought a different set of cuts, that would have been the case. But the principals prepared $1 million reduction budgets in November in anticipation of this. And this is all consistent with what they have identified as things that they would need to reduce, find new ways to manage, or live without. So these aren't out of the blue. They aren't a knee-jerk response. They've been in the works for many months, but we have been extremely concerned with the fallout of making these types of reductions, and I think we're all living through that now. So kind of in recap, we're making 2/3 of our cuts just to hit a number, to make it work in a formula. So no, they're not, it's not necessary. We've done that for 3 years prior. And we are out of, I've seen it categorized in some of the emails that we get, the silent cuts or the quiet cuts that have been happening for years that people just are not, they're not as dramatic because it's not rolled out in response to something. So, I think the frustration is the feeling that we're happy to be part, and we should be part of trying to find a solution, but I do not think the solution results in us, and I don't think it's an overly complicated matter to understand that if we grow at 3.5% and 1% is necessary to make it work through the apportionment formula to come out to 2.5 at the other side, that we are in a continual state of reduction for the foreseeable future, however we package them and however they look. And maybe we can find a way to make them more appealing, but it's still a significant change in operations from what we have now. And I would say the overwhelming number of emails and conversations I have had, there is no mandate to make a significant change to what we're doing now.
Except that we can't get it passed in Essex right now.
So I think we
So
started
that's-
our budget season
right.
thinking, I feel like we fulfilled our responsibility. We've alerted you to the reserves issue.
Mhm.
People can accept it or not. We've alerted you to our obligations with reserves. We've alerted you to the fact that it's been our historic understanding, working with both towns, that use of reserves within the operating budget is poor form and creates a funding cliff. But I'm working against myself in this role right now because I both have a fiscal responsibility, and Avi's a great advisor on that. But ultimately, I have a fiscal responsibility and a program responsibility. And if you're asking me to choose between those two children, I'm going to choose program. So I would say continue to use the reserves. I think there's some good ideas about how we can go forward, but continually modeling, laying people off, and creating disruption within the district has more of an effect than losing that 0.7 reading specialist, right? Because people are not focused on work. They're fearful, they're concerned, they're wondering where we're going, what's the next shoe to drop. And those gaps that are projected are significant. So I think there's been a lot of distraction from the core issue.
Agree.
I heard a rumor that there are resignations coming in. Are you able to comment on that?
I don't have anything formally, but I have verbal.
You have verbal.
What does that mean?
I've been told that someone is intending to take a job in another district.
You haven't been told by that person.
I'm not going to call
No,
that person
right,
out.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any formal resignation letters.
That person told her.
I have a verbal.
Do we have, I don't want to put you on the spot, so I don't mean immediately, but I think it would be helpful for us to see a list of the reductions and deficiencies that we have already found over the last 4 years. And I know that I've seen bits and pieces here and there, but I don't think that I have seen them all together.
I have a list of the positions, and then we have what we call the running record. Okay, so happy to share that. The caution is this: the running record does not necessarily show when we needed to add the bridge teacher after we made a reduction at the elementary school. So it's not, and I know this is causing some stress for people, it is not the net of teachers, it's the positions that are lost. What I think is important for everybody to understand is those positions were able to be added without expanding the budget because we were able to take a reduction in another. But yeah, I can get that up so you can see.
And then do we also have efficiencies such as when we were able to negotiate a change in the healthcare percentage and stuff like that? I don't know if there are other examples similar, but
So the efficiency, I'm glad you brought the healthcare piece up, because this is where if, I wish we had spent some time on the history of the budget at some point this year. Because when we were having discussions in the 2012 to 2015 era, where we did need an override to help us keep up with the amount of staff we needed to add at that point in time. The clear ask from the town of Manchester, and Essex was working on this at the same time, but they were less of a voice in it, was that we needed to find a mechanism for saving and creating an OPEB account, which is a reserve fund of, trust fund, which would sit there to be used when and if we needed to fund an exorbitant retiree health obligation. And you can see in the budget every year that's growing. So a big question is, when do you start utilizing it? But all that being said is, the conversation around that budget cycle, that multi-year budget cycle, was maintain reserves, be prepared for capital investments, don't be coming back to the well when you need those things, you should be planning ahead, and set up a trust fund to ensure that there won't be a taxpayer burden for long-term health obligations. And then we can talk about an override. So we have completely flipped process,
Yeah.
flipped philosophy, flipped operating procedure from that 15-16 time period,
Not long ago.
which is not long ago. But at that time, the view in the importance of reserves was to insulate towns from the oops boiler, the leaky roof. Memorial was the hot issue at the time, and there was a lot there. So, maybe we're feeling a little lost in our process because there has been such a dramatic shift in terms of the expectations of how to build a long-term and stable budget. I'd have to say, I can't speak for Avi, but I can speak for our experience in our conversations, is we were very well aligned with that philosophy, and it made a lot of sense to us. So a lot of what we've done has been in service of that. And we are obviously just flipping course now, so we have to work through some of those issues. So one of the benefits that we got from the healthcare restructure, does tie back to your question, is that we didn't get necessarily a significant positive input to the budget, but what we got was a mechanism of funding OPEB that didn't require us to build in a line item into the operating budget that would be charged to two towns to fund it. So there's a there's a specific formula that's embedded in the contract that determines what portion of healthcare savings each year is put into that fund. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, it's in the meetings for tomorrow, I guess. So that's an efficiency that's taken an obligation on the taxpayers. I think the other two examples that I would bring up are, we do a special assessment. We use our reserves for the different, well, we essentially got dragged around in very opposite directions by, in disrespect to the federal government, by the federal government, we will pay for this, we won't pay for this. And watched other communities have much higher levels of reimbursement than we got because of our perceived level of affluence based on formulas. That's not our determination. Only to finally have a lot of that worked out. And the third one is the turf fields, which I know is like another hornet's nest here, but these are all things where we have been given the mandate to plan ahead and plan on a multi-year basis. And we're kind of feel like we are starting to undo that in pursuit of a short-term solution that will be right back at next year. So while we understand, so the first status with the turf fields was to make sure we had funding available. Step two is to say, is there a better way to do this? And so knowing that we are shedding money from taxation every year on debt service because we structured in a way to limit cost of taxpayers, and you got 300,000 rolling off, this seemed like a way to still reduce cost of taxpayers and get the two new turf fields and pay it off 5 years instead of 8. It seemed like a lot of planning, but again, this is another way where we're kind of starting to backtrack. So I would say, in terms of putting aside what we do on any one of those things, I'm hearing more questions about which individual line to cut. Seems like we're kind of focused on maybe a tree here or a tree there while we're having a pretty big forest problem. And so I'm feeling like it makes it, I think we do need to have stability for employees' sake, because we are hearing about these things. They're not just rumors, they're real. We know that we're in the typical hiring season. And so we're starting to create multi-year problems while we're, I think, fine tuning. To me, when you do need to have a reduction, you're going to be looking at staffing. Staffing is 80% of your budget, especially when you add in the benefits. So you could put in a different list, but you're not going to have an easy cut to solve this problem. And so we put together one that was most aligned with enrollment because we were hearing about enrollment. It's not surprising that there was such a negative reaction. We can spend more time coming up with other things that people will react negatively to. But to me, until you solve the problem that you have to cut $3 for every one of a target, and 2 of those dollars we're hearing from is strongly opposed to those cuts. We can rearrange those deck chairs on the Titanic, but it's really not a good idea because we have 2/3 of voters saying stop. And we have, so I think we need to kind of go back up to how can we get our partners working together on something that is sustainable? We do need sustainability. We can solve a short-term problem and move sustainability to 3 months out. That's how much time it's going to take. But it is unquestionably impacting operations, and we're kind of unclear on what type of strategic direction to take with modeling.
And if the strategic, it almost appears to me that the strategic direction is to shrink the size of the overall district. And if that's what it is, then we just need to understand that, because then you are going to build, we would not be trying to minimize impact. We would just go for complete restructuring. Yeah.
I don't know that that is the message that we're getting collectively from the communities. I think that that is the message that we are getting right now from some people. I hesitate to make decisions based off of that message because I don't think that it is clearly coming from both communities. I will say that we've gotten a number of emails from a handful of emails from people in Essex this week expressing concern that we may not be respecting the vote and that we are somehow stepping on people's, yes, that we are overstepping, that we are not respecting democracy.
Yes.
But I think it's important to remember the bigger context that we are not the town of Essex school district. We are a regional school district, and our 2 communities voted in different ways. So there is literally no path right now that will respect the decisions of both of those votes.
That's true.
Can I ask a procedural process question? So if the compromise budget were to pass without the need for override, so Manchester will need to vote again end of this month, but does Essex need to vote?
Towns need to vote in it. So
Special counsel will be here
Yeah.
tomorrow night to advise you on that. And his advice has been that, given the tenor of these conversations, that it's in the district's best interest that there be 2 town meetings to affirm the new budget. And he can get into the details of what citizens' action could occur should the towns not choose to go in that direction.
Oh, okay.
So that's his advice. And
It's precisely for this reason, because you can respect the wish of one group of taxpayers, and that makes sense. It's easy to understand what that path looks like, and then you have another one say the opposite. And so right now, if you go to the one that failed, you can solve this one, and later you might have a different one that fails. If you don't have that option to vote, you kind of back in the same place. So to me, it seems like there needs to be some town collaborative process going on here while we're trying to figure out what to do.
And historically, I can't say what happened between 01 and 10 or 9, but I can say in the last 13 years, we have never designed a budget to meet the needs of one particular entity. We don't, and I don't want people to misconstrue my comments. When I say we're not Manchester and we're not Essex, we are designed specifically not to do that, but to come up with something that's driven by program and certainly inputs from those 2 communities about what some of the constraints are. But it's not to huddle in a corner with one community and try to design something to meet the specific need. We wouldn't be doing our jobs if we did that. So it's no disrespect to the situation that they're in or to the people of Essex, but we need to build something that tries to synthesize the inputs that we receive from all the constituent groups. So, yeah, I have great hesitation modeling a multi-year reduction of the district to satisfy one of the two partners. If it's a joint desire and we can get in a room, the three parties, and come to some idea of what that should look like, that's fine. But I think it's putting the district, and I'm not the district, it's putting the organization in a very difficult spot to have to choose an alliance between one of the two.
At the same time, I will say this, part of what I've heard a lot of in the last month is, well, if we had known what the issue was going to look like, why didn't you tell us that last fall? Well, there's a lot of reasons that wasn't spelled out last fall, and I don't need to explain them all here right now. But the if we had known, and I think that when it comes to finding common ground, to me the question is, are both towns even in favor of level services? We're not even talking about an increase. If the towns themselves are in favor of level services, then we have a path moving forward to address that, right? But if we have one town that wants a reduced district and one that wants at least level services, that's a different story. Lost my train of thought for a second. What was I saying right before that? What were you saying just now?
Just working to the one town set of constraints shouldn't be the work that we're doing. It should really try to synthesize both. And I hear you on the, if we would have known.
That's what it was.
So I don't know if you all read the article, but Gloucester's going through a similar budget battle, and they're seeking a 4.5% to 5% or more increase this year. So they are here too. And my colleague's response was the same as mine was to you in November, which is, if and when we have the mandate to reduce the budget, we will look at what our needs are at the time and do so. You're going through what happens when you bring out a list. And it's the list that at this point in time best achieves the goal. It's the list that may not be if you're an advocate of French or performing arts, or you have a student in STEAM. These aren't cuts that seem well thought out to you,
Right.
but they are cuts that are well thought out. They're cuts that try to use some objective measure, identifying courses that are under 10, undersubscribed for a couple of years at a time, are looking at our benchmark's 18 to 22. So there is a lot of thought that goes behind it, just like there was a lot of thought that went into the previous 8.5 position reductions, 19 through 23. But when we get into the heat of the moment and people are feeling the loss and it becomes real, you're hearing a lot of advocacy. A lot of the performing arts advocacy is amazing. And it's advocacy for the performing arts. There's no real loss. There's a setback, but there's no loss. So it will get confused. If we do it in September, it will happen. So I have done this before and in different districts. And once you start to put it out there, you will spend a lot of time trying to rework that list to try to get to a place where people feel good, and they will never feel good.
Right. So thank you for getting me back on my train of thought, which was, if we're going to come to a position where our two towns, at least in concept, agree that we want at least what we already have, a level services budget, right? If that really is the case, then we know what that looks like. And we know that cuts to make a certain reduction dollar value, we know what that looks like. But if that's not the case, if we have one town that has enough people saying, enough people showing up to vote that are saying we want a reduced district entirely, then it's hard for the other people in the town and for the partner town, Manchester, to understand what that looks like if we don't show. And I feel like, I know it's chaotic, but we're in the chaos right now too. And if we don't start to show what the difference really would be, and I don't mean for a dollar value, for a 1 year thing, but here's what it means. We have these core programs versus this kind of program. It can be a high level thing, but if we don't start to show and not tell, it's not sinking in. And it hasn't been for the past few years, which we've been trying to do.
So we gotta be real careful how we frame that. The way you just framed it was a reduced program.
Yeah.
And that had a lot of assumptions with it.
Yeah.
And if you go into it that way, then you know what the answer is. So I think we have to be very careful about how we look at program alternatives, right? And reducing or reduction is one way to frame it, but it's already got an implied answer. So I'm not putting an alternative on the table right now. All I'm saying is if we're gonna go down that road, let's figure out how to frame it in a way that can be constructive rather than, oh, look what you're losing.
But I think that you're talking about a much longer term process. Jake. Like if we are going to, correct me if I'm wrong, because you look shocked.
No, I don't know what it would look like. I don't know what this one would look like
Right.
either. All I'm saying is how we frame it matters and could predetermine the answer.
I think in my mind, we are addressing two problems. One of them is the budget for next year, and that is an emergency triage problem. One is the longer term process of how we create the most efficient and effective program that we can, while simultaneously getting our member towns on board
Right.
with whatever that program looks like.
And part of that means tackling what do we mean by excellence and quality, right?
Right.
Which we don't
Absolutely.
necessarily have agreement on.
But I feel like that process, however we solve that second part of the problem, is not necessarily how we solve the budget problem tomorrow. Because I cannot redesign your program by tomorrow.
I will say, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what everybody means by the problem. We keep saying
Right,
that,
yes.
and I don't think we all agree, right? There's one version of the problem that is the statewide structural Prop 2.5 versus town and school growth, right? And we're all trying to live within that, and that's real pressures on all parties here. There seems to be the problem around town commitments to some notion of level services. There seems to be some version of the problem that is about the apportionment. There seems to be some version of the problem that is about stability, whatever the agreed upon percentage is. And then there's versions of the problem that are about either spending or revenues, both on the school and the town side. And the answer is probably all of those things, right? And to me, if we're going to push for, a collaborative work with the town committees and the towns more broadly, we got to tackle all of those, right? It's not solving one version of that problem, whatever that is.
Do you think there's room within this, though, to really rely on the strategic plan, which did involve considerable input from both communities and which was intended to be a 10-year outlook and plan for this? I mean, there's room.
Our strategic plan?
Yes.
No, our strategic plan is simply about program components that we want to see enhanced. And in many ways, we've treated it as layering on to our existing program. There's potential for some restructuring within that, but it doesn't speak to the broader community of that list I just gave. It doesn't speak to any of that. It speaks about program components we want to see enhanced in the long term.
Jake, when you talk about the problem as it relates to, not wanting to characterize it as reducing the program because you want to think creatively about a different way. What I hear as a non-educator is something that nobody wants me to do, which is redesign a way to deliver education. That's not that doesn't match with my qualifications. And I don't actually think it's a school committee's mandate. I mean, I think that if Pam were to tell us, if her administrators tell her that there's a better, more efficient, more effective way to be delivering curriculum, and if we can do that and also reduce the budget at the same time, well, of course that makes sense. But I don't know if we can sit here and brainstorm, new ways to do education, or I don't think I have those skills.
Well, the bigger question is our community asking for that?
I guess I respectfully have
that's
a
what I
different view of what the strategic plan has done, because I think there was a mandate within the inputs from the strategic plan not to change course drastically, but to enhance and grow the program. I think there was a lot in there around maintaining academic rigor and excellence in the traditional sense, while at the same time exploring a more authentic way of promoting. So I don't
So
know.
Pam, I think we just said the same thing with different words.
I guess my caution in sensitive spots, so apologies to anything, is the district isn't actively looking to layer on. I think I've been trying to say this about the strategic plan from the beginning. It isn't it does not need to be a large financial obligation to anyone, and it doesn't necessarily need to cause us to expand the budget. If I looked at this a year and a half ago, we see some enrollment reduction, measured enrollment reduction opportunities for the reinvestment and for the supporting of the development of the new ideas, allowing them to be seeded, develop, grow, incubate, become ready to roll, and then create opportunities for new efficiencies to be made in other areas. We're in a position where every retirement is now seen as dollars in the bank and a way to close the gap. So while at one point I would have said what we needed was some money to support professional development, which we have historically had enough, but not a great amount in the budget. We supplement that with grants to pursue that development work. We were in great shape, but as we remove every piece of perceived, every position becomes a savings. We're chipping away at our ability to manage just those things. That's why we're passionate about the small cap line. We're extremely passionate about that. I mean, it's small money in the scope of the large budget, but there's a laundry list of items that need to be taken care of every year. And sure, you can let them go, but then they become larger ticket items. So I think that's my frustration. I'm glad we're kind of on the same page. I just don't want to give and haven't wanted to give to the community the perception that we're seeking some financial investment in the strategic plan that reflects the fact that we haven't heard people about the financial constraints. But at the same time, we can't just keep shedding every opportunity for reinvestment in the district. We spend a lot of time on library. That's a perfect example. One of these retirements at the secondary level could have turned into a reinvestment in the library. Wouldn't have expanded the budget, won't shrink the budget, but it would have been a budget neutral way to improve a program.
I'd like to piggyback on it just from a math standpoint. So for years, what we've said in our budget presentations is that anything that we need to do differently that might result in an ad, we're going to try to fund internally. So this process is just say what Pam's saying in different words. We're going to lose that ability to do that. So if the strategic plan says, hey, can you do something differently? The answer is not if everything's down to the bone, A, but B, to your point, I agree with your list of issues and problems. The one thing I might be missing, I don't really think it's true, and I think it's potentially unintentionally misleading to anyone who dials into this call. I don't think you can solve our problem without reducing. So I think that using a different phrase, I think is unintentionally misleading people to think that we can solve anywhere close to this number. And I understand why you're saying, I agree with the sentiment, which is to say, are there creative ways to do that? Yes, 100%, but not to hit these numbers. These numbers are too big. You have to reduce. You will be having to reduce. You could say reduce A versus B, which is really going to come down to, as Erica said, I think what I've seen over the years, typically not things that I suggest as much as educational leaders at all distributed sites based on what they know. So we are in a reduction scenario here. I just feel like I don't want us to be talking about a happy opportunity that comes out of this. I just don't see one mathematically at all. So please correct me if you're seeing something different, because I'm not the only math person at the table, but that is what you're paying me to be here.
Thank you, Avi, and I appreciate that. And I think I went back to our original proposed budget, and when you did the kind of forecast model for us back in January, even with the quote full budget that we put forth, we were already committing to additional reductions and use of reserves every year coming up. Right. So I think that's what you're saying, right?
We are 3.5 anyway.
To get to 3.5, right?
That's that
Which is
pie
even,
chart,
right.
right? And I remember we had a conversation about that, which is, that's where the known versus the unknown works for us. So we know that to get to 3.5, we always have about $250,000 of creative work to do every year. And that's where the efficiencies comes in. That's where, the principals look at what they need versus what they want, or finding a new way of doing things. Knowing that piece of it is the stability. It may not be the preferred way of doing business. It would be wonderful if we had that 250 to reinvest every year. But it's something we have been modeling for, planning for. Everybody is kind of programmed to do it, to address it. When you start to get into the other components of that pie chart, the the apportionment piece and getting to 2.5 in addition, that's where that number grows from 250 roundly to 950. And 950, I'm with Avi. It probably, I don't know if history is important anymore, but again, like I've been in other districts. When you're at this point, it's people, and it's people that becomes the program, because program and people are somewhat synonymous. In a district this size, it's a lot of times it's just attached to one individual or one individual's certification or skill set. It shouldn't be, but we are very small.
Is my pie chart, is that in this one? I can't remember. I'm
It
trying to
should
find
be.
it. I think it is.
Yeah, you don't have the
Because
clicker.
I have a thought on that too. I've been thinking about this pie chart, especially. Oh, here it is. It's where my pen leaked on everything the other day. It really just spilled right over it.
So we're looking at composition of the
Mhm.
915.
I'm looking, yeah. So when I think about this pie chart, I think of, I have this little model in my head of like the 3.5 to 4 that is the natural growth rate, or even a little higher, getting down to that 3.5, obviously is that first chunk. And then getting down to below that to 3.5 for Essex. Again, it's not a formal request we have right now. It's just working with the best information we've gained over the past few years. And then that additional section of getting to 2.5 to Essex is really just, again, that's working within the law, the structure of the law that we have. And again, I don't believe, especially Guy Bradford sent an email yesterday that I forwarded on to the rest of the committee as well. I don't think that the town of Essex as a whole, and again, we have some really passionate people who feel strongly about bringing down the budget to Essex, and I understand that right now. I don't think the town as a whole wants us in negative growth or in at 1%. I really don't think that. I think that this is a little bit inaccurate because, or not inaccurate, but misleading. Like it gives us the worst case scenario of what we would have to do to get to something that wouldn't require asking for more, right? But even then, we don't know that Essex would be willing to use all of the excess capacity for 2.5. So we're really at a point where we need to understand from the town of Essex. We don't even need a target growth number, because I understand that's causing a lot of issues for commitment, not just this year, but in the previous year as the town of Essex worked on its strategic plan. Having a hard time feeling okay committing to a number even for a target spending growth rate. But even if we just had for the next 3 years, their expected budget model. I mean, they have a finance committee. Surely that's a thing. I've talked to Chairman Buttrick about this, that if we at least had that, because again, I think that they understand well that there's new growth. They understand what other pieces of the pie are, just like here, you've got the master chess, picture in your head. If we could get Essex to give us 3 years of data, 3 years of modeling, of upcoming modeling, so that we can plan for that, then we're able to actually look at and say, here's what a district with this looks like. And both towns can decide, is this something we're willing to support? But really the next step has to be getting that from Essex. Again, it's a different question than what we've been asking. What we've been asking is an understanding of a spending target, which then gets thrown off by apportionment. So if they can at least give us, what is your budget for the next few years look like?
I will say in the early years of working on this problem, when apportionment was looking the other way, I think we had a general sense of, at what point our assessment would break the model, so to speak. So I do think that would be very
So
helpful.
the precedent for this sort of a,
100%.
Yeah.
I think that was kind of overtly stated, and to be honest, it really wasn't that surprising. It was essentially, Prop 2.5 plus new growth, plus or minus some changes based on other departmental lines that are happening within the town model and based on their priorities that they had of where they wanted to invest their dollars. So I think, we're trying to create stability. I think some multi-year planning inputs to us would be helpful. I've shown you what they look like, the pie chart. I think it is not misleading, because what I'm hearing is plan, override spoke, plan on 2.5. So that's what it looks like. You could tweak it here or there. And, you may have, lose 75,000 here or there, but it's not gonna change a whole lot. And I think right now, our goal is not to get every last dollar perfect. It's to understand how big is the bread box? It's
Yeah.
that big.
Yeah.
What are the components? Those are the components. And then we just need our communities, our financial
Yeah.
input providers to tell us more of this, less of this is what we can support.
Yeah, I think, and just to clarify, I think you're right. I used the wrong words there. Not that it's misleading. This is the safety. This is the safety version. Like, this
Or
is
any
what
portion of that. They could say, take off the blue part. 'Cause
Right.
We're gonna handle from 2.5 to 3.5 total assessment. Or they could say, we got apportionment, so just go to the top part. We just need, those are options. There's 3 different
Yes.
levels of potential inputs that they could be providing to us.
Yeah.
There could be a different chart that looks different, that works for their model that they have.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to look like this,
Right,
but I think those are the questions we need answered.
right.
Are we solving to a single town assessment level? Are we solving to a joint assessment level where apportionment gets picked up by the towns? If so, what is that number?
Yeah.
I think those are really the 2 main questions that we need
Yeah.
answered.
I agree.
So, I think we're all talking about the same thing, one way or the other, to tell you the truth. But just to add on to what you were saying, and Avi, so, I think all 3 entities, we have our own version of the next 5 years projection. I think the key is not to have Essex to give us what they have, because they already have it. And we, like Avi, like you mentioned, we kind of know. We know, like, just to plug in some numbers, like the 2.5, whatever it is, we can kind of know which direction is heading for us and for all entity. But I do think it's more than that. It's more about going a little bit step beyond it, not just to look at the very broad, like, for example, our projection is just a very blank 3.5% increase every year. What does it look like? How does that apportionment change and all that stuff? I think we actually need to do the forecasting projection, the line details, and then make our assumption, the budget assumptions about how that changed. And then the 3 entities we need to work together is how this impacts those towns and the district. Because it's not a district budget problem, it's a 3 entity problems. And we all need to be on the same page about how that impacts both towns.
I think what I'm missing there, though, is that until we have the information from, right now, the district with a level services plan moving forward, reinvesting to, has full support from Manchester. So this as it is, and that modeling out that forecasting has support from one of our towns, the town that's the heavier weight in terms of voting, but it doesn't have support from the town of Essex right now. So yes, it's all 3, but I guess I'm seeing it in the reverse from you.
So, in my opinion, how we're voting tomorrow, which version, whatever version that we put out tomorrow, or it gets voted through, any of the scenario is not going to solve the problem that we are talking about right now.
Right, we're talking about the big one now.
Right.
Yeah.
So the big one, I think that's what I'm saying. We're all talking about the same thing. I think we are all on the same page about which direction it needs to go to. The next step is really for the 3 towns to work together, because there are so many issues that we want to talk about. There's so many questions, and it's not. We just need to get all the key players in the same room and then to kind of all be on the same page.
My
We're all
question
talking
about
about
that
the
though
same
is, are you proposing that we have towns weigh in on which of the line items they do or don't want to see? Because I'm kind of hearing the difference between what the 2 of you are saying, and I'm just asking because I've got to build the model. So, because we have to have a budget that shows the detail of how we're spending the money, and maybe it's a 25 issue, in which case I can back off of that, but also knowing that we tend to start every year pretty early and then feel like we're running out of time. I do think we need to understand whether we're going to start with blue and red, or blue, red, and green,
Right.
from both towns. And then once we know that, then we can say, here's what that looks like.
Yeah.
If we're gonna, or are you saying you want scenarios for each of those options and then let them pick? Because I think at that point, I think essentially you're handing over program decisions to each of the towns.
No, I'm not saying that. So I'm saying that we should do our projection we should refine it. Let's put it that way. So instead of just a blanket 3.5% of the bottom line, we need to have justifications about the budget assumption. So it makes sense to people. For example, if we are just 3.5%, including all the budget lines like salary, special ed, like, the maintenance and all the different things. There's a lot of things. Some of it might be 3.5, some of it might be 5 or 7. In health insurance, for example, different things are different budget assumptions, and that might be the key drivers. I do think that a more refined projection can tell people more stories about what's behind an assumption will be more transparent and will be easier to understand. And then we can line it up. Because Essex might have, I mean, even Manchester.
I guess my only reaction to that is this document did that. I think we heard some really loud feedback from the community. And again, I don't want to get into the school committee role here as opposed to the guy who pushes the buttons on the numbers role, but I think we've done that for 1 year alone. The next year will be a worst case of this with more upset people. And I just feel like, we need I would recommend we start making more decisions about
I
that.
think, Jenna, are you saying if we take the budget and break it down as a communication tool and say, look, health insurance costs have risen 6%. And we say that's something that's completely out of our control. We cannot, we have negotiated as much as we can. This is as low as we can get the rate, 6%. That's what it is. COLA is at 2.5, 2.25, 2.5, 2.5. We've already negotiated that. That is set in stone. And then once we look at the bigger picture, there's only so much wiggle room. Is that what you're saying? That we then have identified exactly how much?
And
Yes.
this is why I would say let's not overcomplicate breakfast, because if in black and white, we show it and start with it every year. Why do we talk about cuts to personnel? Because that's our budget. If you call it program, you can call it personnel. That's all we are. There aren't any other categories to get any substantive savings from. You got your personnel, your insurance, your overhead, your pension. Out of district is only 4%. It can't swing because it's mandated, right? So there's a cost in there. If it comes in, you can't choose not to pay that. And then everything else is pretty small.
Can I recommend something? Because I talked to other district school committee, the finance people. They say that it's very common for other school district to have a reserve specific restricted reserve pot for other districts, just because it swings so much.
Yep.
And that will help to stabilize our budget.
And that's what our reserves have gone toward over the past 8 years. We're not a municipality. As a single town municipality, there's been a move to create a stabilization account, which is shared by both. So that when there is an unexpected out of district placement, you don't have to hold a special town meeting to get additional financing. We discussed that several years ago at the board level. And the decision was we had ample reserves. We had a strong reserve policy and process, and that was always a backstop for us in any given year. The school committee could vote to expend school choice reserve funds without going to town meeting to pay for unanticipated. So we have it.
Plus, we
It's just
also use the
bundled.
end of the year money at the end of the year with the budget. It's on the memo that we'll discuss tomorrow night, that we do use end of the year savings when we have it available. First and foremost, to make sure that we are mitigating any change from new placements that happen since November, when we set the out-of-district budget for this coming year until now, which they're very large. Sometimes they go down. Good. They go up sometimes as they're expected.
I'll just want to say to anybody who's looking at the chart, this is from our tentative budget, so the total spending line was accurate as of 12/14, but it's not the current. I just didn't have a current chart to pull.
I know all these things are relevant, but I am on a tight window with my day job. And I would like to ask that we focus on tomorrow, because we have a big opinion. And I want to just say this, and I think I've said it before, but I remain super conflicted by the feedback that we've gotten from Essex through the ballot box, which is that the original budget isn't supported. And the really quite dramatic feedback we've gotten predominantly from Manchester, although it's not entirely Manchester. There's also a lot of families from Essex saying, please continue with the original budget. I mean, I don't know how to solve that problem.
Yeah, so tomorrow night, one of the things we're going to have to decide, so we will have to break this into a couple things, the big picture conversation, and I think we can talk about process for that tomorrow night at some point as well, maybe before we start
Maybe at
this. So that-
midnight.
Well, no, maybe just starting before we head into this so that we can set it aside, so that we can at least feel like there is a plan and a way to go forward from this. So now we can focus on the work at hand. We are going to have to decide together whether or not we support asking Essex taxpayers to consider this again in terms of an override ask, because we cannot guarantee if we send back anything other than that, yes, the Essex boards would have the option. It's not out of the realm of possibility that they might choose a different path than an override, but we can't control that. So all we know at this point is that if we send it back, anything,
Right, but we have
So
to also be
have to
mindful
decide
that
if we're
if
doing
we're gonna
that.
send this back to Manchester,
right?
and they
It-
might not
precisely.
pass a reduced budget. So, I
Precisely.
mean, this is,
Yeah.
it's,
So in my mind, the first decision we need to make as a committee tomorrow
Mhm.
is, are we trying to solve the budget problem this year? Right? And if we're solving the budget problem this year, we are either committing to a cut package and continuing those cuts.
Yep.
In years to come, or we are trying to get a budget correction and override that would include an override in Essex so that we can continue to grow at a steady rate
but when,
while still finding efficiencies.
it
right,
might
'cause
not
it would
include
reset
an
it.
override though, right? Like, because Essex might still vote down the override. We
Right.
end up at a joint town meeting.
And so then, right, so then it's, are we trying to solve the budget problem this year? Or are we
giving it
going
one more?
to
Yeah.
try to create a process through which we can thoughtfully address the budget problem so that we can buy ourselves one more year?
Right.
Either scenario, we're kicking the can down the road for another year, either scenario.
I don't think
I
we
don't
are.
see the first one as kicking, I
Let me-
feel like
let
if
me-
if we did an override, which
Let me explain. If we
Go
did
ahead.
an override, if we push the same budget forward and have another override, doesn't matter if it goes through or not in Essex, and we're still gonna get through at the end, maybe. But what I mean by it's just kicking the can down the road is because, sure, we are gonna secure this year's budget. The same tension, the same situation is all gonna come back again next year. We're gonna go into the same override situation, the same discussion again next year.
but we will have reset the bar, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that instead of growing from here, we're growing from here.
But that also means the discussion is gonna be even more tense, because the bar is already higher.
Mhm.
So what I'm saying is, either way, it's gonna be an issue, is the fundamental problem that we still have.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna solve a budget problem this year.
I'd like to provide some more clarity on that as well. So even if we were to cut the budget by 10% this year,
Yeah,
The
pause
budget is
just for a
still-
sec, Chris. Chris, pause just for a sec. I just want to let everyone online know, in case you're not paying attention, that we have Chris and John joining us. That's John, right?
Yeah.
Chris and John are school committee members joining us online, and therefore they are part of this, but we're not taking public input or comment. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
so even if we were to cut the budget by, say, 10% this year, something drastic, right? The budget is still going to go up by 3.5% next year. The apportionment issue for Essex is not going to go away, which is still going to require an override vote in Essex either next year or the year after. Cutting budget is a 1-year fix no matter which way you slice it. So both ways are still, no matter what we do, both ways are not fixing the structural issue that we have. And as a school committee, we also cannot fix the structural issue that we have today. If you look, I spent some time and just had some questions on the sheet, Avi and Pam, that you shared on Thursday last week. And, to me, it looks like, something like 8 out of the past 10 years, the Essex assessment growth as a percentage has been less than the Manchester's assessment growth, right? And then I think in like 8 out of the 12 years, our total assessment for a school district has been under 3.5% or right at it. I look at these numbers and please, anyone else on the committee, tell me if I'm looking at this incorrectly, but to me, that looks like the school district and especially the administration has done an exemplary job in keeping our costs down as a district so that we're under the levy limits of Prop 2.5. And again, the levy limit of Prop 2.5, I just want to make sure that everyone on the committee is clear on that too. I've spent a lot of time looking at the law. That does not mean that the town's budget has a cap of going up 2.5% or 2.5% every year. That doesn't mean that at all, right? There's formulas for new growth, which means a lot of different things. As a school district, we only have one form of revenue, which is from our member towns. A town has multiple forms of revenue. It's not just property taxes, right? There's fees for taxes on new vehicles, new boats, all your excise taxes. There's water and sewer fees that the town collects. There's a lot of different ways that the town collects revenue. It is rare for a town anywhere in Massachusetts to be, well, I shouldn't say rare, it does happen, right? But especially in inflationary times, it is rare and next to impossible for a town to be under a 2.5% increase year over year. So, that's not, I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that. Does anyone else besides me read the law of Prop 2.5?
Yes, I understand it.
All right, cool. That's all I have.
To
So I
add
guess
to
like the other part is, am I misunderstanding these numbers?
No.
But I think, to add on to what you're saying, Chris, I think, yes, the town's revenues and they have different revenue sources. And they are our primary revenue source, but I think somebody, made a comment the other day in one of the finance committee meetings, I think it was the Essex committee meeting, that this is we don't have a revenue, issue, that this is our expense issue. I disagree with that because for us to manage the budget, to net zero, we need to look at both the revenue and the expense. So yes, our primary revenue source is from the town, from the taxes, but we do have revenue source from, government as well. We have revenue source from athletic fees. We have revenue source from grants. We have many other revenue sources. And I think it's only responsible for us as a school committee to not only look at expense and also the revenue side, see how we can continue to expand our resources as much as that we can.
Yeah, but hold on. Isn't that, that work's not going to be done between today and tomorrow? And
That's
you
not
were on the
about
finance
tomorrow.
subcommittee and you were on the finance subcommittee this year. So in all those meetings. So didn't you already do that work this year for this budget?
No, we didn't go into the revenue to discuss, athletic fees, how much do we increase, how much what would that look like? The different grant options, are we looking at applying, X, Y, and Z
I
grants?
can save everyone a lot of
Gonna
time
say,
right
yeah,
now.
I feel like,
The athletic fees, maybe you could get 15 to 20,000, you might get 0, depending on what your user level is. And grant numbers are generally ways to support staffing already, and they're fixed. So they're entitlement grants. We don't get a lot of them because of our income levels. So while we are in a revenue constraint problem at the taxpayer level that we all understand and respect, the federal government that allocates grants is saying you are at the bottom of the list for those items. So based on your perceived levels of income relative to other communities.
Not
So-
just the government grants. So like, for example, if we're changing this, smart TV, smart board, $200,000.
Yeah,
Have we reached out to other, technology company, corporations that will give us the grant? Because other districts have done that and other nonprofits have done that.
yeah. So we do.
So things
use-
like that, that's.
Yeah,
one
and we
example.
do those. I'm just trying to tell you, we're dealing with a $915,000 problem.
No, I get
And
that.
so I just feel like, again, I think it's just like Jake's comment about, and I no disrespect here, I'm not trying to pick on what you said, but setting the expectation that we can do this without reductions, I think would be a similar misleading not intentionally misleading message to the community that we can use other revenue sources to get out of this problem. We have 85% of our revenue coming from the towns because the state has said, you're not a chapter 70 district that gets more than that. We should totally do that work. 100%. We should be transparent about it. We should turn it over every rock. We just can't use it to solve these big problems.
Totally
We can
agree.
just use it to get incremental revenue.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
please, let's do that. So everyone, it will build assurances that we're doing everything. I absolutely want to engage in that work. I
Yeah.
just want to make sure it doesn't take the place of this work,
Of
which
course.
is the pie chart.
Yeah.
That's all.
And Avi, can you be clear too on that? We continually engage with that in that work every year.
Yes.
Of course.
So 100%. So just some examples that people may not remember. We've got the community grants that we did, the green community grants that we did with Essex. That was a great way to take off our capital plan. We've got E-rate, which is a way that we've taken off of the school committee asked for technology investments where it can take 40%. We've used enhancement, regional innovation grants to reinvest in out-of-district programming that became in-district that now saves us. So 100%, there's a lot of those levers. They don't solve the structural problem, but they do help, and they show the community that we're not just putting our hands out saying
Right.
more money. That's not the intent.
And from a
Yeah.
practical level, grants are one-time funding used to incentivize some type of desired outcome. So they're wonderful seed money, but they have it sets up a different funding cliff.
Which
So-
we're experiencing with our math interventionists right now.
Yeah.
That's what we'll
Correct.
be facing next year, exactly. So it's absolutely a resource for us. But it's usually, there's a purpose behind the grant. It's not free money.
It's a
It's to get to a certain outcome. And then the expectation is frequently that you take over that expenditure yourself.
So
Jake
no
wanted to
offense,
say something. Sorry, oh,
real
do you
quick.
want to
So,
finish
so
your
no offense,
thought?
like, I feel like we keep going around and around on this. I've heard this told to me at least a dozen times over the past 2 years. So thank you again for saying it again, but I just feel like we keep going around and around with this stuff.
And
Although
I
I do
think,
appreciate the debate and it's important, I just think we need to understand what the realities are.
I think we're also in a climate where we can certainly look at fees. We've raised them before and it is it's small money, but it's money. We're going to be facing some significant changes in education. It is a matter of time before universal pre-K becomes a requirement, not an investment. We're doing it as an investment right now. We fund it. We fund the required components, which is the special ed component, through some operating, and the rest is all has been through the community innovation grants and revolving funds. So that's fee for service. That's going to go away in a few years. There's a movement toward reduction of fees for students, particularly in athletics, that it should be equitably accessible to all, and you shouldn't have to, that should be carried by the town. So I think we're moving into a new era. And this would be, I think, I project that it's counterproductive to the sentiment going forward and what the expectations will be on schools.
Can I, Jake,
very
Jake
quick
was, he waited so patiently. Did you want to say?
And I hope I'm coming back to your question, Erica, which is, Chris, we are going round and round. And from my understanding of people and Pam and Avi, we've had this conversation not only the past couple of years, but 5, 7 years. I don't know how many years, right? We've been going around this.
Honestly, I'll give you the
And
answer. This
Just
conversation.
let me finish, please. So, not only are we saying that we've done all we can, the towns are saying they're doing all they can. Right? So for us to say that, it's got to go back to the towns to fix it, the towns are telling us they don't have the mechanism to fix it. Right? So somehow we have to get out of this mode of, it's not my issue, it's their issue, and figure out how to come together collaboratively on that. We are not going to define that in the next day, nor in the next month. So to Erica's question, to me, tomorrow is about how do we best set ourselves up so that we can engage in that process next year, right? How do we keep the parties together,
Mhm.
right, without inflaming one or the other,
Right.
and
You don't want that
hardening
inflamed?
positions. We don't want to harden positions, right? So to me, it's about how do we best set the conditions so that we can work through this with time to do it over next year with our partners.
Right. Pam, did you want to?
I would just say, I think the data
And then
shows,
Erica and then
the
Anna.
data tracks to when the conversation started. The conversation started in FY19. That's when some of the reductions began. We took a bit of a pause during COVID, but came out of FY25 with an at the school committee, it's on record someplace, request for a look at a 2.5% budget. And then this conversation has tracked 21, 22, and 23. So I think if you look at the data, we can ask Essex absolutely to provide us a forecast, but it tracks with the shift That's true. It tracks with the shift in the assessment and the apportionment, putting Essex over 2.5. As soon as it triggered over 2.5, it became a problem. We talked for several years about building bridges, using reserve revenue to create kind of a bridge over, that we would build up reserve use and then maybe come out with a taper down to ride through the apportionment. But that's when this conversation really began. It tracks with the data.
Do we have the ability to forecast what the, how the apportionment is going to impact the assessment next year?
That's the pie chart. I can,
But what's the percent? That's where we get our.
yeah, it was about a half point up for Essex in my rough math.
So right here, I'm looking at 7.12%, and you're saying I'd be looking at 7.6.
Well, not building off of the budget that no longer exists. I think what I saw with the apportionment in a rough forecast is that if Essex right now is at a 393 with no override, I was showing at like 5.04 in my rough model for the following year, assuming that enrollment doesn't change again and that it stays the same from a pie chart basis, because another year data will roll in. And we really don't know. I think we actually saw a
So
slight
5-year or 10-year?
3-year.
3-year.
And we did see that
3-year,
this year's K actually reversed the trend a little bit.
That's what I was.
So like
Which direction?
grade 1 and 2 had a proportional increase towards Essex, even though enrollment's going down overall. Grade K kind of went back to a more traditional level of closer to the, whatever it is, 60-40 or 3-45. We don't know what the trend is. Will the new K kind of be a second year back to the old trend, and maybe we just have 2 years of volatility? Either way, that's where we're at. We're seeing about, I said half a point. It looks like it's about a point of increase to Essex over the midline.
Can we go back to tomorrow? So I get that, you know, a lot of support from Manchester, want to have the same budget push forward. But, you know, at the same time, in the public budget hearing, that day, we also have Manchester, both the, Board of Selectmen and the FinCom together saying that they support the compromise budget. Same is Essex, FinCom and Board of Selectmen, they say they support the compromise budget.
We haven't heard from Board of Selectmen. They meet tonight.
Right,
I would-
but at least the FinCom, they mentioned last time in the FinCom, when I call in, they say they support the compromise budget.
And I would specify that they supported a compromise
Right,
budget,
right,
not
a
necessarily the,
Right,
because we hadn't even presented what currently referred to as the compromise.
They did
on our
have that in
packet.
it. They did have that info.
yeah, we presented
Yeah,
in the.
they did
public
have that
hearing.
info. But they didn't really get into the two
But the,
stipulations.
The
Anyway,
vote was prior to the presentation, I think is what
Right.
he's saying.
it wasn't.
Yes, it was.
yes,
The vote was
From the
before the
Essex
meeting
Finance
started,
Committee?
and we put it up at the public hearing.
I thought we were talking about the Essex FinCom.
The Essex FinCom is recent, like last
It
week,
was
right?
last Wednesday night.
Yeah, I think she was talking about the Manchester
Oh,
one.
I'm
right,
sorry.
I'm talking about at the
I'm sorry. I thought you were
the
talking about
public
Essex.
hearing.
Gotcha.
We heard from the
Yeah.
town partners before
They are
we
talking
even
about
presented
a
that.
compromise,
Yeah,
yes.
Mhm,
Gotcha.
mhm.
Yeah, but Anna, that, I mean, while I respect that and that's an important perspective, at least from the input I've received, it doesn't actually reflect our community and our constituents. It is what our town board said that they had agreed upon, but that is not the 500 emails I've seen that say, please adopt the compromise. They're actually saying, please stick with the original budget. We don't want to see a series
I
of
know,
continuing
yeah.
cuts. So, I mean, we have to be listening to both sides, and I come
Yeah.
back to not really sure how to do that.
Well, this is not a good idea, but it is an idea. I mean, you could just put it, block your ears. You could just put in $700,000 in reserves and figure it out next year. Keep your whole program in place. Everything stops in its tracks, and then you build a really big, it's a really big funding clip. Then you're at 1.5 million probably. That 900 would go to 1.5 million, because it's not sustainable over.
Right.
You'd have a couple of years where you could do that. I mean, that would have been the next step, right? If we didn't go down this, and I realize the whole premise behind this budget is not using reserves, so just hear me for a second. We were at 520 last year. It was at 330 the year before. The next, it's gonna go up, so that 700 doesn't just come out of no place as the gap to fill. If you wanted to use that or somewhere between 250 and that to stave off even more cuts, you might be able to get Manchester its desired outcome in terms of no changes to program for the time being, and get Essex its need for relief in terms of the cost of.
I just
But
don't
we don't have-
understand why we would draw 750 out of reserves next year, looking at 1 point something, or 750 this year, looking at 1 point something next year, and rather than use that money to fund the fields, which is a capital expense.
Well, I think we would have to finance the fields at that point.
Right.
Right.
You're both.
You would, yeah, you'd be doing both. You'd be using you'd be basically reserving your reserves to handle emergencies at Essex and balance your budget.
Yeah.
That's that's where we have revenue. Anyone who's ever talked to me about budgeting says this is a very bad idea, but this is where, again, I've got the fiscal responsibility in the kid program, and I'm hearing Erica and I'm hearing everyone say you have two very conflicted points of view on what is manageable.
Can I ask then, because yeah, it is a tough decision, but, you know, looking at the compromised budget, some of those are not as impacting directly on programs and others. So as a, in your role, Pam, because you are more in tune with exactly how the programs will be impacted or not, what would you recommend the school committee between all the different versions or the options?
Give me a second to think.
Because I think it would be important to know from your perspective, and then so we can see if we.
Well, I think what we
support
tried to do is put out things, as offensive as they may be to some people, and I get it, I
Yeah.
really get it. We tried to put out things that we could work through and around.
Yeah.
Try to figure out ways of minimizing some of the staffing. Like who would lose jobs? We've got some open positions. So what's on there is something that the team has made recommendation that they can live with if they have to make the cuts. If we had to go through and rank them, I need to give it a little bit more thought. I think I took you through last week. And honestly, there's certain things on here. The paraprofessionals are all, I think we talked about that last week.
Yeah, yeah.
Those are all either reorganization or changing student need. And we did reserve a position not on here in anticipation of a move-in or a change in summer need. I would keep, I guess, the top three.
To reduce, you mean?
Yep, I would keep those as cuts. And then of the 4.65, I think we talked about.
Like the reading specialist is key, like I risk, I mean.
I think that's a matter of perception, really. I think my principals are saying that they can manage through the year, but I'm with Kate on we think we can handle it, but what happens if we're finding that it's not working as well? Or we're not able to get to as many students? What's the likelihood of returning the position? So I guess I could make an argument to hold on to that for another year as well. We're gonna go through with an LTS, there'll be some savings. I would let the elementary classroom go, knowing we've reserved one, and I think the music is enough, the music in the elementary classroom. And the math science retirement. I think are three that can be easily managed, and I would also be okay with the reading specialist. If we needed to go that far.
The reason for going this direction would be, as someone has already articulated, to use this coming year to try to address the situation that we all know is untenable. However, I'm cognizant of the fact that everyone who sat on this committee for longer than I have says that every year this has been somewhat of the same refrain. So I'm just, as a new member, to vote for that compromise package, I'd want to feel like there's a point.
Yeah.
There's a point that we feel like the outcome, somehow the negotiations are going to lead us to a better compromise than they have for the last 4 years, that this has been the desire, we've had a different desired outcome every year for the last 4 years. So why do we feel like we're going to get a different result this year?
I can speak to that briefly, because as you're saying, before you're saying that, I've kind of chunked this out in my mind at its most fundamental. Tomorrow night, we have to decide if for this year, we are committed to a level services program. If so, we send the budget back as is. We let what happens, happens. We could end up in a two-town meeting knowing it would pass. If we're committed to that, if that,
Wait.
like. Hold on,
But
I'm not
that's not the
suggesting it's
only-
the idea.
But that's not the only way to provide level services.
No, I'm
Okay.
getting there, yeah. So, but if we know that that's the thing that we are committed to, that is an option, that is one option. If we know that we're committed to saying, this has been an ongoing pattern, we know it's a problem, we have to bring this down, we could take the full cuts package, right? If we know we're committed to either finding way to align the two towns for a slightly reduced educational experience or even level services, and want to use a structured reduction of reserves to get there, to give us one more year, then we can do that compromise budget, doing exactly this, right? But that one comes with, we need to understand the process for what comes next. And that's where we come full circle in this conversation back to the big picture issue here. And tomorrow.
I actually think Eric is asking a slightly different question. Almost no matter
Right.
which scenario
Yeah.
we go with, how do we know that something's gonna be different next year?
Yeah.
Either way, we need to have the process laid out. So that's something I've been working on, to actually lay out a process so that there is an outcome point at some point.
You
And
don't,
we can discuss it
you
further
don't,
tomorrow.
you have no assurances unless
Right,
either town wants to offer them up, which would be amazing, but they may not be ready because we haven't done that work yet. And so we might need more time, but I hear you.
And that was my biggest hesitation with the compromise package, was that what we would receive in that compromise was supposedly this mediated budget process. My hesitation is that a mediation has no guaranteed outcome in either direction, right? There's no guarantee that even if we went through that process, there would be any agreed upon result.
So I'll just say with any relationship, there's no guarantees of any outcome, right? We can only control what we can control. We can take a step to doing that, or we can harden our position. Right? In essence, the different options are sending a signal about whether or not we're hardening our position or trying to stay open to things.
So tomorrow,
Can I just speak? So in my head, the facilitated outcome, it may not be what I would recommend is in the best interest of the district, or the principals might recommend, or this group may feel. But I think we're in a position, from my perspective, the district as an organization is in the position of being pulled in two different directions without the tools to solve the problem. But a facilitated mediation, facilitated process might allow for is for the two town to have representation to speak to each other about the difficulty of managing their relationship and their commitment as made through the regional agreement without, not that we don't want to do the work or we cannot do the work, but it keeps circling back to the district needs to do all of these things, as a school organization should be doing all of these things differently when the apportionment isn't lining up correctly on one side of the ledger. I think there are fair questions in there that can be answered. But if this is going to happen over the years, every time there's a swing in apportionment, and you're going to be pulled between two vastly different perspectives of what investments should look like in the district, this is never going to be stable, and you're never going to hit full forward progress. Because we were kind of at a launch point, and now we're taking 10 steps back. That would be my desired outcome in a facilitated arrangement, that there is some memorialization of belief system. And maybe this should have been done in 2001, hindsight's 2020, right? But we have core values, we have a mission statement as a district, but that's done somewhat aside from the two towns. What's their vision and mission as a regional organization, as a commitment to one another?
and each town has their own strategic plan. In Manchester, it might be called a master plan, I'm not sure. Each town has their own version of that perhaps it would be good for us to review on our own time so that we understand what each town actually has committed to and put on paper. Essex just did it, I believe, for the first time and just finished it last year.
And I think I see in the history, a lot of safeguards put in place to ensure that they weren't individual deal makings with each town, with the district making deals with each town, that it was all supposed to be done jointly. So that would be my only concern, is if we start to mold and shape to one direction, we're not working as the three legs of the stool.
So to answer Erica's question, I think Pam, what you're saying is you do feel the process, if we were to have this joint budget mediated process, you do feel like this might seem like a potentially with a different outcome than previous years, that you feel better about.
Well, I think if both towns understand that it can only be, we're here, all right, this is the district now. If the district has to be here because that's what the two-town compromise can bear, then that's fine. But I don't think it's fair to put the organization itself in a position to advocate for its own demise, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
That if it's a structural reorganization that needs to take place based on agreed upon constraints within the two towns, then we will answer the call. We will fulfill that responsibility. It has played out over the past 4 or 5 years that the district's unwillingness to, and I will say, reduce the scope of its program is the driving force behind this problem. But what we know is it's an apportionment imbalance that's creating real problems for one community, and their desired outcome is something that's not syncing up with the desired outcome of the broader parent community population in the two towns combined.
Well, we have a lot to think about between now and tomorrow. Thank you all for your time again today. I understand a couple of people have to jet. Shall we call it here so that we're all sort of stopping at the same time at this point?
Sure.
Okay,
Motion to adjourn.
well, hold on. Were you gonna
Was
say-
there interest in showing, did you want me to put more reserves in the compromise, leave it as is? Was there any?
I would, if like the reading specialist, like we talk about, if that is your out of the whole 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 thing or 5 thing, is that you feel is probably the number one at risk, or that you feel the least comfortable about. I actually personally would probably add 30,
Yep,
can't really read
right.
some thousand into the reserve. We're still gonna be above, $3 million. In my opinion, that will, if that will make you feel more comfortable, I will recommend that.
I'll talk to the principals
Yeah.
and let's.
Maybe just a prioritization of the.
We'll do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, sorry, guys.
Thank you.
Okay. Adjourn. We no longer have a quorum in person anyway.
Right.
Second.
All in favor? We are adjourned at 1:45 PM.
Stop recording.